Hi, Michal. Thank you for being with us today and taking the time for this conversation. I'm very happy to be able to talk with you after I had the opportunity in December last year to watch in a workshop organized by Energy Policy Group from Romania. One of your colleagues presented a short report on one of your studies realized by Bellona Europa. And it was very interesting on a very hot topic in Romania today. I suppose that is also the case with Poland, your home country. So, welcome at Energynomics Talks.
Hi, Gabriel. Thanks for having me. Always happy to talk about CCS.
Please, before starting, say a few words about your organization, about Bellona Europa, and about yourself, and about your responsibilities within the organization.
Yeah, sure. So Bellona Europa is part of a large organization called the Bellona Foundation, which is headquartered in Oslo, is the leading NGO, environmental NGO in Norway, working on a range of various environmental topics, but with a huge focus on climate policy, on climate technologies, and has a dedicated separate team based in Brussels, and we're called Bellona Europa, and that's the team I'm a part of. And our focus, the focus of our work is on industrial decarbonization, on decarbonization of transport, electrification, hydrogen, sustainable finance, circular economy. So I would say the main topics that you can come across in today's conversations about climate policy. Me personally, I joined Bellona a year ago. I came previously. I worked for the fertilizer industry for the European Association of Fertilizer Producers. So I'm coming with a background of working for an energy-intensive industry, and now working with Bellona as climate technology and policy manager, focusing on carbon capture and storage, and with a particular focus on promoting CCS, carbon capture and storage, in Central and Eastern Europe.
I see. So you are the most important person in this conversation from Bellona at the moment.
Not really sure. That's not really the case. I'm still. I still consider myself as a newbie in the field of CCS, although I think I had quite a steep learning curve. But Bellona. If you talk about CCS in Europe, I guess the Bellona name comes up pretty often, and we're probably the first NGO, maybe in the world, for sure in Europe, I think, that put CCS on the agenda, and that was already in the 90s, way before I joined. So yeah, I suppose that in many topics, Bellona was quite visionary, and I'm sure that CCS is one of those examples where already in the 90s, Bellona saw a big potential for CCS as a decarbonization solution.
When preparing for this conversation, I had the chance to read a little bit on one of Bellona's reports. Almost 10 years ago, Bellona published a roadmap for CCS for Romania. So dozen of pages dedicated to what Romania could do for tackling this issue of CO2 emissions. And you are probably aware about a plan of initiative in Romania, Jetica, it was called, and it was the main focus of this report. So yes, I'm very grateful for Bellona organization for existing and attacking this, addressing these issues for so long. Tell me a few words about CO2 topic in Poland, your country of origin. If you are familiar, I don't know if you live still in Poland or in Brussels.
Sure. No, currently I live in Brussels. I've been living in Brussels for almost 15 years by now. but obviously I'm trying to keep tabs on what's going on in Poland. And in this particular context of CCS, Poland has indeed quite a history in CCS. I guess we should maybe mention the unfortunate false start or fiasco of CCS about a decade ago, when the European Commission had an ambitious plan to support the development of 12 demonstration plants, CCS demonstration plants, and I think 2 of them were supposed to be built up in Poland. Unfortunately, it failed. At that time, it was actually connected to the power generation. We'll probably talk about that a bit later as the focus of CCS has shifted away from the power generation. But at that time, CCS was perceived as a decarbonization solution for countries heavily reliant on fossil fuels like Poland. It was a combination of things why it didn't work at that time. The carbon cost, the ETS price was very low at the time, so there was very little financial incentive to invest in CCS and similar decarbonization technologies. Also, I think from the administrative point of view, things were not working perfectly fine. There were some elements of public resistance that derailed some of the projects. And I think ultimately the power sector realized that there are better, more efficient, cheaper alternatives to decarbonize power generation, namely renewables. So that was the story of the early start of CCS that failed in Poland and beyond Poland in Europe, as there were plans for other countries to build CCS. None of them really materialized. And for some years, nothing really happened in that area, including in Poland. People stopped talking about that. But we can see renewed interest in CCS, and I think the big driver was the Paris Agreement and the scientific consensus in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which called for net zero targets globally. And if you're talking about net zero targets, you're no longer talking about decarbonizing only the power sector. You need to look at other sectors. And in this,
and then it came the Green Deal in Europe, and then it came the
Green Deal
new funding available from the EU for
yes.
such initiatives. Yeah, I will just add a few words about the Jetica project in Romania, where of course the price in CO2 emissions allowances was also a factor. But talking 2 years ago in a workshop we organized online with some of the people involved in the project back then, one of the ladies said that the main factor is also important at the moment, and that is getting the politicians involved in these projects, because the industry was more or less aligned. Also the financial institutions, there were some important sums of money available from Europe, from Norwegia, for different source of money. And also the universities, the academia was fully supporting the project. But what happened was that many of the small steps that were necessary for such a project to start were forgotten in various lockers when we had some changes in the government or in the parliament, and the projects couldn't start at all in the end. I think that this is also a problem at the moment, although the general situation, the general context is much more favorable today than 10 or 15 years ago. So we'll talk about the context throughout this conversation, but what I suggested was to start maybe from where is the technology now, and if are any projects that evolve beyond the demonstration, beyond pilot. Do we have any example of commercially viable CCS project in Europe or anywhere in the world?
Sure. So about the technological maturity of CCS, like the short answer would be it is a mature technology. As you go deeper, this becomes more nuanced, because you can also look at the separate elements of the CCS. So and I think many people like to refer to CCS as a set of technologies, plural, rather than one single technology, because you have the capture technology, and there is a whole array of possibilities at various stages of technology readiness. You have technologies that have been applied for decades as far as capture of CO2 is concerned. Then we have the transport element, which is also technologically and commercially mature. We have been transporting CO2 for several decades already. You may not be aware, or some people may not be aware, but CO2 is being transported by trucks, by ships, from industrial sites where it's a byproduct. It's often shipped to the food industry, to greenhouses for agriculture. The carbonated drinks, the bubbles in the drinks are essentially CO2 coming from industrial processes. And then finally, we have the storage element, and there also we have examples going back to the 70s and in Europe, to particularly in Norway. There is one storage site called Sleipner that has been operating since the mid-90s. So that's already more than 2 decades of storage experience. So again, the short answer would be it's technologically mature.
So if you are looking for mature technology, you can find, and you can build a project from A to Z using mature technology. Of course, that would not be the most efficient, I suppose.
It's I think if you look at them in isolation, the answer is yes. You can find projects that today, or as of October last year, and I'm basing my comment on the Global CCS Institute publication. As far as I remember, there were 27 commercial CCS projects operating globally, most of them in the US, but some also in Middle East, in Brazil, in China, Canada. So you can find sort of projects that work. Now, putting it all together is a real challenge. I mean, combining, capturing CO2, having a way to transport this CO2 from the capture point to the storage point, having the storage facility identified, characterized, developed. It takes a long time, and typically takes between 7 to 10 years to develop the full-scale project. And also, the US, where this technology developed, I suppose, the fastest and is the most extensive in the world. As an important element, it's not really done as a climate technology. It is actually done to enhance oil production, because you can use CO2 to press out more oil or more hydrocarbons from the ocean.
So we are talking about a different value chain here, a smaller value chain, and it's all under the control of a single entity most of the time. I know the oil and gas operator, I suppose, is interested and has the full control on all these operations, from capture to usage.
I suppose that can vary. One interesting thing I came across, which to be honest shocked me a bit, is that in the US, most of the CO2 that is currently used for enhanced oil recovery is not really captured from industrial processes. It's actually extracted from natural reservoirs of CO2. So there's absolutely no climate benefit in that. You're basically taking CO2 from underground, putting it back underground.
I suppose that is cheaper?
That is possibly cheaper, yes.
We'll be talking once again about the value chain, of course, but maybe do you have any insight, any answer to the question, why is Europe lagging behind other regions of the world in this respect?
Well, one reason why lagging behind is that we don't have that extensive oil and gas production to develop enhanced oil recovery. And as Bellona, as an environmental NGO, we're quite happy about that. We don't really want to see more enhanced oil recovery, especially in Europe. But other than EOR, so the enhanced oil recovery, there is very little reason to do CCS. Obviously, there's a big reason to combat, to mitigate climate change. That's a big reason. But since companies are private enterprises, they, profit driven, and there's currently no strong price signal to reduce CO2 emissions, then in the absence of EOR, which can be a financial incentive to do that, you won't be doing CCS unless you.
So in Europe, you had very few countries where the industry was developed enough to even take into consideration this EOR. I mean, Norway,
I think
Great Britain,
it's happening
Romania,
in
maybe the Netherlands and
Croatia. I know that it's happening in Croatia, possibly in Romania, as far as I remember. Not Great Britain, and in Norway, you have CCS indeed, but it's coming from natural gas processing. So basically, Norway in the 90s introduced carbon tax, and also the requirements concerning the content of CO2 in methane that you can put into the distribution grid were set, and that motivated the Norwegian oil and gas industry to capture CO2 from their natural gas processing facilities. There are LNG facilities, and then put it back in underground storage. So there was an incentive in the form of a carbon tax and also regulatory requirements for the composition of the gas.
Okay, so the conclusion after 10 to 15 minutes in our conversation, it started in the oil industry, and there are some examples where it's already used for commercial ends. It also was a great interest in using CCS in the coal industry and coal firing generation of electricity with no significant results, at least in Europe. And we are at a different stage now. The industries interested in CCS are much numerous now, and also the incentives. Let's say a few words about those new industries entering into this conversation.
Yes, that's very interesting, because I feel like the debate about decarbonization has been, especially in our region where we are from, so Central and Eastern Europe, was pretty much dominated by the decarbonization of the power sector. But once you decarbonize the power sector, you need to look beyond that. And if you look at heavy industry is responsible for around 20% of greenhouse gas emissions in Europe. And so far the narrative was, okay, it's very difficult to decarbonize our processes. It's often process emissions. It's just happens because it's our feedstock that is carbon intensive. There's no other way, or if there are alternatives that are too expensive or they're not technologically available at the moment. But as the climate ambition in the EU is increasing, following the targets set by the Paris Agreement, the requirement to achieve net zero targets, so basically to reduce emissions as much as possible and to sort of neutralize those emissions from for example, agriculture, where it's really difficult to get rid of them, maybe impossible, technology was super expensive, we would need some technologies that will help us offset or neutralize these residual emissions in for example, in agriculture. So again, one reason is that the focus of decarbonization has now broadened beyond the power sector and is now including industrial sectors. Therefore, industries have to start planning for that and thinking, okay, how can we decarbonize our processes? And there are several avenues of action. You can obviously work on, maybe the first step would always be to energy efficiency. So let's reduce the use of fossil fuels. Maybe we can replace our feedstock. Maybe we can electrify some processes. But then you have an industry like cement, for instance, where there is, I think, very little, practically no large-scale emission reduction technology other than CCS. And that's because in the production of cement, you take the raw material, you sort of bake that, and you have the byproduct CO2. You cannot replace that raw material if you want to produce cement. So therefore, you left with the CO2 emissions, and therefore you need to look at CCS. That sort of turns out to be your only large-scale technological option. You can obviously use maybe some biomass for your heating to reduce the climate impact of your fuel requirement. But as far as your feedstock goes, CCS turns out to be your only meaningful option. So you have the example of cement. There are other chemical processes where
the refining industry, I suppose, is one.
Yes. So essentially, industries that use hydrogen today. So we have the refining industry that uses hydrogen. Also, you need to produce hydrogen to make ammonia, and then in turn, from ammonia you make nitrogen fertilizers. That is also a sector that uses hydrogen. And one technological pathway to decarbonize the production of hydrogen is through electrolytic hydrogen, so using the electrolysis powered by renewable electricity. But that depends on the availability of clean electricity at scale, at cost, at affordable cost, the sufficient scale. And
I stop you for a moment with one question. Do you see these two direction the EU is enforcing now as competitors, hydrogen and CCS? So more hydrogen would make CCS less important, less needed?
I think there is a clear preference in the EU for green hydrogen, so electrolytic hydrogen. But
until we have there are other. We have to use other methods.
So some people argue, and I think we broadly agree with that we may not have that hydrogen
soon enough
at a sufficient scale. So rather than waiting for our grids to fully decarbonize, because if you want to source your electricity for your electrolyzer from the grid, I mean, if you do that in Poland, I suppose if you do that in Romania, that's not really green hydrogen, is it? Because that's the content of fossil fuels in the grid is still fairly high.
And if you are to build new renewable, new green generation facilities, you would have to use them first to cover the current needs.
Current needs, and also
to replace the units that have to be closed.
That for sure, and also the best use of electricity is through direct electrification of processes, rather than using it for making hydrogen. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't be used to make green hydrogen. by all means, we should support that, but let's keep that in mind, that we should not cannibalize, the available amounts of green electricity to make hydrogen in some cases where it maybe makes more sense to install a CCS unit or carbon capture unit and produce that hydrogen through the CCS route.
Okay, I think that it's a moment for another conclusion, something that I didn't think before, and that is CCS solutions might be better understood as localized solutions for particular cases, and maybe hydrogen too, and not like a solution for greening the whole I don't know, industry in a country or the whole energy system in a country, but like very targeted solutions for industries or maybe industrial units.
Absolutely. CCS is not a one-size-fits-all kind of tool that you can just use on everything. I think each installation, each region has to be assessed, and what is the grid, what is the carbon intensity of the grid? Does this production facility have access to enough electricity? If not, let's consider building a capture unit, and specifically talking about industry. Very often you're talking about industrial clusters. So it's I think rarely industrial cells are just built in isolation. Often you have these complexes grouping different sectors or factories from different sectors, and that is, I suppose, the new model for CCS development. This is where the action will probably happen in the coming years. So the decarbonization of industrial clusters, where you can build one big pipeline for CO2 transport that can then be connected through smaller pipelines or other modalities of CO2 transport. Could be train or trucks or ships, or even inland waterway through a barge. It could be connected to a larger pipeline, and this way you can achieve a large-scale decarbonization effect if you're looking at industrial clusters rather than isolated power plants.
Thank you. What can you say about the real potential in the field, in Romania and in Poland, in respect with the CCS technologies? Are there any particular units, industries, companies that seem to be more qualified for entering this enterprise, this sector?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, I just add that in Romania we already have some ads running on Facebook, paid and built by OMV Petrom, in respect with what carbon capture means. So there is a particular effort from such a large company to educate the general public with this, and there are also some lines in their strategy for the next decade mentioning carbon capture and storage.
That's really good that companies are investing efforts in educating the broader public. If you ask me what would be the priority sectors, I understand that would be a question that could apply.
And also,
CCS.
if you see particular industries and companies, maybe players in.
I mentioned cement, and we believe that that is definitely one of the priority sectors, simply because of the lack of technological alternatives to achieve the same level of decarbonization of cement that you can achieve if you apply CCS. So don't know about Romania, but I can imagine that, like in most countries, there are cement production facilities.
Yes, and they are running full day and full night for some years, and it seems that it will be the case for the next years. Fortunately,
Yes,
Romania
I
just
think
started to build a little more faster the highways and new
exactly.
blocks of flats. And
Yeah, new constructions that will always require cement, a lot of cement. So it's a no regret option. I mean, if you're a government, just try to think, what do you want to do? How do you want to decarbonize your cement sector in your country? And you realize that at some point, okay, you can electrify a bit, you can change the feedstock for your heat generation, maybe some biomass, stop using coal, but to really get rid of the large chunk of emissions, you need to capture carbon from the process. So cement is for me one of the top candidates for CCS. I would then say the ammonia production, so ammonia/fertilizer sector, and that is because they already capture CO2. So at fairly low costs, because it's just part of the process. That CO2 is currently either vented or used in other products. But essentially in the ammonia production process, CO2 is almost ready to be just taken off for transport and storage. So that's another sector. Some chemical processes as well. Now, when we're talking about petrochemical or the fuel refining sector, that is, I need to ask, or we need to ask ourselves, are these industries viable in the net zero, for the net zero future? I mean, relying on
to become very soon stranded assets, and then if
possibly,
that's
yes.
the case, is it rational to invest more money in new technologies like this? Okay.
Absolutely. So rather than continuing to produce fossil based fuels for transport, maybe we need to rethink that and not consider is it good for CCS or not. I suppose if they are there and continue to produce for another decade or two, obviously it's better that they have calculation. It's better that they have CCS than if they don't have the CCS. That's just for climate. As long as we keep emissions away from the atmosphere, I think that's sort of the ultimate test for this. There are on top of those that I mentioned, so the cement, ammonia, steel industry, especially those facilities that are still using blast furnaces. You can equip them with CCS. That would also allow us to reduce the carbon footprint. There are some interesting emerging applications of CCS in waste to energy facilities. That is maybe less popular in our region, in Central and Eastern Europe, as a lot of waste is still landfilled. So it's just basically stored in the open. But in Northwest and Western Europe, it's very common to have waste incinerators. And I think the general direction in Europe is to move away from landfilling into other ways of managing waste. And
I must add that in Romania, for my perception, no studies or something like that, but just a perception for a journalist, even waste burning, waste incineration is not at all popular with the general public. So for me, it is very, very complicated to imagine a specific city, municipality accepting, where people living there to accept such an industrial facility. So I fear that I will not see something like this in Romania.
I realize, and I'm not an advocate for waste incineration. What I'm trying to say is that currently I don't know that much about Romania, but I know about Poland. The waste problem, because there is not many waste incinerators in Poland, I suppose like in Romania, we end up with a huge landfilling problem.
Okay.
And also illegal dumping of waste, and this waste is burnt anyway in through illegal ways. It's not subject to any regulation.
So what you stress out is that the current situation is even worse than what we might have.
Absolutely. And I'm not an expert in waste management, but as far as I understand, it's always you need to start with recycling, recycle, reuse as much as you can. But there will always be a fraction of your waste that you have very limited options to work with. So in that case, you can produce heat and power by incinerating that fraction of waste. And if you have to do that because you've explored other options and you're left with this option, then have CCS installed on it. It's obviously expensive at the moment, but there are already some. Fortum is trying to do that in Norway, in Oslo, and they are quite advanced. They will be part of the Norwegian project called Northern Lights. So the government of Norway is supporting that. There's a cement plant and a waste to energy plant that will be plugged into a larger CO2 infrastructure project that will store CO2 in the North Sea as part of the Northern Lights project. So we see that emerging in Scandinavia. We have a waste energy plant in Oslo. There's another one in Copenhagen that is also considering a CCS investment. Some other facilities in the Netherlands. So it could seem very unlikely in Romania.
There are countries which are known for championing the clean environment and the well-being of the citizens. So maybe we should be more attentive to their action. Yeah,
I think so.
Okay, that would be the industries. Then now maybe if you see any particular I don't know, any particular sources of blockages in the Eastern Europe, Romania, Poland, and all the countries neighboring us, maybe other than those already mentioned, the poor capacity of the central administration to coordinate and direct such projects. But what should we be careful about and maybe trying to help?
I would start with the at the EU level. I think we need to have an EU-wide CCS strategy, modeled a bit on what happened with hydrogen. There was an EU hydrogen strategy, and I really think it helped raise the profile of hydrogen. Who knows what would have happened? Would hydrogen have been such a hype as it is today? I think the fact that the EU sort of mainstreamed that as a technological option really helped.
For me, there are three elements with the hydrogen strategy that made it very important, and I saw that other people in Romania also identify them. One is this strategy per se, okay? So it's important for us at the EU level. Second, there are some targets that there are some numbers, some large number of gigawatts.
Timeline and targets,
Yes, and then there are huge money put behind this strategy. So there will be some billion euros available for making this strategy to happen. And I think that, yes, in the case of CCS, that would work too.
Yeah, so EU level strategy to send a strong signal also to member states that EU is recognizing that, and because it is recognizing, the European Commission is recognizing CCS. Other international bodies are recognizing the role of CCS, the IPCC, the International Energy Agency. And last year, the European Commission held its first annual CCUS forum, Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage Forum. And we had top officials in charge of the energy and climate portfolio in the EU. So Kadri Simpson, the Commissioner for Energy, and Frans Timmermans, the Vice President of the Commission responsible for the European Green Deal. They had keynote speeches at the event, and they confirmed that there is a role for CCS in the EU long-term decarbonization strategy for industrial decarbonization, which we've just discussed, but also importantly for carbon dioxide removals, which is maybe also one kind of strand of action that maybe we could spend some time a bit later on. Yes. And so I think the call from the industry or those stakeholders that are concerned with CCS is that we need CCS strategy at the EU level. We need more funding instruments that are earmarked for CCS, and specifically and especially above all to rolling out the transport and storage infrastructure. That is absolutely the most crucial element for success of CCS. No industrial project will invest in capturing carbon if they don't know what they are going to do with that afterwards. And if you realize that the lead time to develop transport and storage infrastructure can be up to 10 years, you really need to, as a government, you need to start planning for it already now. So here again, having a strong signal from Brussels that the EU is ready to put more funding, just like we're putting funding, European money into gas interconnectors, electricity grids. There should be money that is spent on CO2 networks, so CO2 transport infrastructure. Recently, that has been. There is already money that is allocated to infrastructure projects in energy and CO2 projects, but unfortunately, it doesn't recognize other modalities of transport other than pipelines. So currently, only CO2 pipelines are eligible for EU funding.
It seems a bit a more expensive solution.
Well, in some cases, they make sense to have a pipeline, but in some cases,
if you use existing pipelines, I suppose.
That's complicated. You cannot use all types of pipelines for CO2 transport just because of the design of the pipelines. They were not designed for the pressures that are required to push CO2.
So you have in mind only short distances that might be covered with new pipelines built especially for CO2.
I think it makes more sense to use pipelines for shorter distances, but also it makes a lot of sense, to use other forms of transport like ships. Norway, the Norwegian project Northern Lights will use CO2 ships. In fact, it will use multiple modalities, but like the shipping through CO2 ships will be the key element. But for smaller emitters, it doesn't always make sense to build a pipeline. Sometimes it's just easier to transport that CO2 by barge on the river, or by trucks, or by train, or to ship it from a port to another location where then it can be maybe on a shorter distance.
What would be this kind of support that national government might put for this infrastructure? I don't know, maybe because it seems that in different cases you use the existing infrastructure. I don't know, buses on highways or ships, or what do you have in mind when you say about the specific support for the transport infrastructure, if not pipelines?
I'm talking about ships that have larger capacity to transport CO2. So that require CO2 requires specific conditions. Not all ships that are carrying cargo are suitable for CO2 storage. It's less to do with different technologies than those that exist today, but rather recognizing at the EU level that CO2 can be transported by other things than pipelines. And if you have a project like Northern Lights developed by Norway that is willing to offtake CO2 from other countries than Norway, but they will not build a pipeline to each and every facility that could plug into this project. The more flexible option is to use ships, but it requires some financial support. As we said, CCS is economically difficult to justify. So it's just a matter of recognizing that it's not just pipelines, it's other modalities that should also be supported if we are serious about rolling out the CCS infrastructure.
I see now. And another idea is becoming very clear now, that idea that in a specific region, let's say Eastern Europe, it would be unreasonable to build the infrastructure for storage in every country, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Serbia, and I don't know where. Most probably the clever idea is to have a significant volume of storage, let's say in Romania, and build maybe together all the countries the transport infrastructure, or make it possible to happen this transport infrastructure in order to store the CO2 produced in different countries.
Absolutely, and that's what I meant by this EU funding. I meant the funding for cross-border projects. So basically, what you explained, there will be regions or countries that don't have the storage capacity, so they cannot be deprived of this availability of storage somewhere else. Therefore, we need to put more support into this sort of
and correct me if I'm wrong, at the moment the PCI, project of common interest, also include the CCS.
So I was exactly talking about the PCI, so projects of common interest. So these are projects that are funded from the EU budget through the Connecting Europe facility. That's the name of the sort of allocated amount of money for in the budget for this sort of projects. And currently, as far as CO2 infrastructure is concerned, only pipelines were eligible for only pipeline-based projects were eligible for that. That has been recently extended to storage, but still modalities other than pipelines are still not recognized. And yeah, this is something we at Bellona feel very strongly about, and we are advocating very strongly in looking for allies to convince the EU, the member states, that there needs to be a dedicated funding mechanism at the EU level that is supporting modalities other than pipelines.
We are talking about some sources of blockage, and you mentioned a kind of solution. We have this blockage now in the EU regulation. We might change this, and that would be better. Any other suggestion in this respect?
Yes, I think that we mentioned the case of Jetica and how I suppose it was a shift, the change of government overnight, that one government supporting it, the next government ignored the project, and the project collapsed in the end. So let's start by building political consensus around that across the aisle. So so it doesn't become a political issue. That is one option, political party is supporting that, and the other one, just because the government changes hands and the other party scraps the plan. So the recognition of the importance of CCS across the political spectrum is important. And then crucially, including that in your country's long-term climate strategy is important, again, because that sends a signal that we understand the potential of CCS. We know what the problem is in our country. We know that we have sectors that cannot decarbonize without it. Therefore, we are including that in our plan. then the industries know that government knows that this is important, and you can start, the cooperation. And you're not going to the government explaining why it is important. The government already understands, and you can move faster.
Mm-hmm.
So
and if it's a 10 years plan, you can start gathering the experts, paying them for years, as is necessary in this kind of projects.
It is, yes, because you need to figure out what is the authority that will be in charge of the CO2 network in the country. Just like you have gas system operators, you have dedicated bodies that are in charge of that. You have dedicated regulatory framework around this. What is the composition of gas in the case of a natural gas network. Similarly, in the case of a CO2 network, you need to have a dedicated authority that will sort these things out. So on what basis you can inject CO2 into the grid, CO2 grid, who can do that, the accounting rules, to make sure that if it's stored, you account it properly. What else? Well, in some cases, maybe it's a good idea to start with removing the bans on storage, because we have countries where storage is simply banned. Mm-hmm. And maybe in some cases it makes sense. In some cases it doesn't. So it would be a good start to reconsider that, given the importance of CCS, and see if there is a need to continue this ban.
Are there any examples in Europe where authorities already went this way and put in place the authorities, the regulation, and all necessary?
Well, Norway would be an example, an obvious example, I think. But in the EU, I'm not sure if there are dedicated CO2 authorities yet. Could be that in some countries, it's the companies or the organizations that are in charge of the gas network. That could be the case in the Netherlands, but that's something I need to look up. Actually, that's a very interesting question.
Thank you. And maybe closing, I'm interested if you can tell us a few words about the situation in Poland in respect to its CCS before closing.
Sure. So we have seen quite a lot of development lately in Poland. As far as I know, the government has formed a sort of interministerial group that is looking at CCS. I know that there were public consultation around that earlier last year. One of the PCI projects that were selected in the last round of the process that is supposed to choose those candidate projects that are eligible to get EU money to further develop the CO2 infrastructure is a project in Gdańsk. That is Gdańsk is a major Polish city in the north, on the Baltic coast, a major port as well. They have been selected as one of the CO2 net infrastructure projects. We have had a major oil producer, Lotos, that together with a fertilizer producer, Grupa Azoty, wrote a white paper on CCS. And the paper contains some suggestions to the government as to what kind of roadblocks exist in the Polish regulatory system that currently hinder the development of CCS. They have also run a simulation of a CCS project that would move CO2 from inland Poland and store it in the Baltic area. And I have seen also in several cases, big industrial companies started mentioning CCS and considering like what are existing technologies, as they realize that with the increasing cost of ETS, it's only expected to increase further. The economics of CCS change, and something that used to be considered as totally unfeasible it's starting to make sense. So we have the government that is, looking again at CCS. We have the industry that is considering CCS. We have some emerging infrastructure projects like the one in Gdańsk. So looks quite promising, to be honest.
And there's also one direction we should look with the. I don't know in Poland, but in Romania, many of the cement factories are part of European groups, and
I forgot to mention one.
I suppose that some projects tested or already in place in France maybe can be replicated in Romania or in Poland if companies are operating this way.
Indeed, we have we heard from Heidelberg Cement, an international cement company, announced earlier last year that they are planning to test CO2 capture technology in one of their cement production sites in southwest Poland.
One final question, and sorry if I keep you much longer than we agreed, but do you see a specific possibility that carbon capture, storage, and usage to prompt the development of a value chain, or is more like buy the technology, install in your factory, and that's it all? Is there any chance it would be necessary to build something more in terms of local industry, or I don't know, something like that?
I think there is you have a point there, because first of all if you decide to roll out a CCS value chain in a country, you will need a workforce and materials to build pipelines. You will need to build these capture units on industrial sites. That creates employment. Building the transport infrastructure, the pipes, operating CO2 ships, designing, constructing ships is another opportunity for countries that have the ship construction sector. And yes, I think there is quite a value chain that you can build around CCS. Also including the storage, the expertise that we currently have in the oil and gas industry could be employed in this sort of value chain around CO2 storage.
Yes, I see this as a subject for further investigation, this value chain for CCS. And thank you very much, Michal, for this conversation, for the clarification, for the information. Thank you also for the work you do in Bellona, and in general for the activity of this organization. If any word you want to say to our viewers, please, this is the moment.
All right, so looking forward to see more development both in Poland, in Romania, around CCS, and beyond these two countries in the wider Central and Eastern European region. And if anyone wants to reach out to Bellona, be it civil society organizations, journalists, academia, industry, or government, we're always happy to engage in discussions with you and share our expertise, and hopefully help develop CCS to further accelerate climate action in our region.
Thank you. It was Michal Wendolowski, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you also for joining us, for listening to this conversation, and also for the messages that you send us with ideas for next interviews, for next conversation. This is it for today. That was Energynomics Talks. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.